welcome to Varn Blog, and I'm here with William Welser, founder of Lotic and technologist who is interested in storytelling, and understanding ourselves in light of technological changes. We're here to talk about why stories are important, what we both learn and don't learn about ourselves with them, and how artificial intelligence models, particularly LLMs, may be helpful or harmful, and what we need to do about that. So I'd like to welcome Bill Welser. Hi, how are you doing today?
Hey, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. Yeah, a technologist interested in stories other than like pitching them to shareholders is not something we generally think of. Why is the context of storytelling so important to your work?
So, storytelling is maybe the purest source of data about oneself. So, the way that we express ourselves, the way we make sense of the world around us, that all comes out via story. And when I say the word story, I'm not talking about like once upon a time. I'm talking about disclosing how we're feeling, what we're seeing, what we're experiencing. And if you take all of that information, which is really just context about who we are, where we are, what we're doing, et cetera, and you turn that into data, it is the most powerful, personalized source of data around.
So how do you transform narrative stories into data? There's a long history of like data scientists being very skeptical of narrative.
Yeah, so my background is in chemical engineering. I started my career in the Air Force building large technology systems and big cyber systems, satellites and lasers, and like a bunch of different things. And then I went to the Rand Corporation. It's a big nonprofit think tank. It's about 75 plus years old at this point. It's the quintessential think tank. Excuse my, I have a little bit of allergies going on. And while I was at Rand, I met these, I was hanging out with a bunch of technologists, but I met these really, really interesting people. And they, fell into this grouping of behavioral scientists. They're like clinical psychologists, IO psychologists, anthropologists, ethnographers, all these really interesting perspectives on how a human works. And when I was done at Rand, I'd spent a decade there and I wanted to get into building something. So I entered the startup space and I started a technology company. And my first hires, and the company Lotic, my first hires were actually behavioral scientists. And I didn't bring in software engineers and machine learning experts and other sorts of technologists until after I had worked with the behavioral scientists in some great universities in the country, like University of Pennsylvania, to better understand how to, from an algorithmic standpoint, typify what's happening up here and get down into the subconscious of someone, their motivations, their expectations, et cetera. So yes, I know data scientists have been, back to your point, data scientists all, for a long time have been like, messy narrative and what kind of signal can you get out of that? And it's really, blah, blah, blah. If you take it from the perspective of someone who understands how the brain works, it turns out it's really beautiful signal. It's really wonderful signal.
What do you think are some of the key things about how the brain works that current, say, machine learning developers or other kinds of data scientists who are working for interactive technologies? What are they missing?
Well, I mean, I think one of the simplest things is we just listened to, a minute or so of me talking, and I jumped from topic to topic. And in my head, I'm jumping from topic to topic without really thinking about it beforehand. Like I'm telling a story and I'm telling it to you how I think it's going to make the most sense. Whether it did or not, that's up to you, right? That's up to you to conclude. But it's that jumping from topic to topic as we associate things to one another and how we associate them, it's quite emergent. I mean, we're complex systems ourselves. I would say we're like the most complex system on the planet. And that emergence of connection between topics, how we tie them together, how tightly we tie them together, et cetera, it's very, very hard for someone to program that.
Mm-hmm. How do you think we're currently doing in programming that with LLMs?
So LLMs are wonderful tools. And I started Lotic in April of 2020 with two huge unknowns, it turns out. So the first one was that we were going to have a pandemic. I had no idea. The second one, we kind of guessed that something like large language models were going to hit the scene, but had no idea how they were going to hit the scene and the extent to which they have. I mean, they really have transformed the way that we deal with the world. And so it's important to, one, recognize the power there. But in that power, it's quite limited to, I mean, it's learning off of known data. It's learning off of, corpi of information that it's just cycling through to better predict what should come next based on what just previously was stated, right? And if it's starting from scratch, like you're giving it a prompt and it's going to start and it's going to do this kind of iteration of what should come next, what should come next. And so it's this nice, like predictive, kind of like how a browser fills things in for you, right? Except just a lot more powerful. LLMs don't have that connective capability, that context switching capability that humans have to switch context on the fly and to do so in an emergent fashion based on experience. Now, they can trick us into thinking that is happening, but that is only because there is training data somewhere. There is data that they're pulling from somewhere that says that is a pattern that has existed. And we're going to follow that pattern here because it is the most appropriate thing to follow. But it is not because it's processing the same way we are in our heads.
So it is intelligent in a sense, but it's not intelligent like a person. And that's important to keep in mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I think about the data supply chain as kind of like you have raw data, and that's like really noisy and really messy and whatnot. And then you have information, and information is like the signal that you can pull out of that raw data. And from there, you move to intelligence. And intelligence is like putting that signal into context. And, that's great. And that's kind of where LLMs sit. The next thing after that, though, is wisdom. And wisdom is actionable intelligence. What do I do with that as a human? What is the action that I'm going to take? The LLMs aren't there yet because they can't be. Like, I'm still making, it doesn't matter what an LLM tells me, right? It's very intelligent in the sense that it can give me really great information, that it's been put into context, so it's intelligence. But for me to go take action on it, that requires wisdom.
So there are a lot of promises coming from these kinds of artificial intelligences. And I want to be very specific to my audience. If I am saying LLMs when you think I should be saying LIs, because LLMs are a specific kind of artificial intelligence. They're not the only kind, actually. And there seems to be three different sets of fears around LLMs. One, it's going to take all of our jobs. Two, I find this one a little bit ludicrous, but I do think there are some parts of it that aren't, that it's going to become so intelligent it's just going to want to kill us all. I mean, which seems to me to be kind of, there's a chain of assumptions in that I find weird. And then three, excuse me. See, we went non-linearly again.
I love it. I love it. Right.
Three, we are spending a lot of resources into a glorified probability machine. And I've listened to you talk on this. I've listened to a couple of your TED Talks, And you don't seem to think the latter is true, and you don't seem to think the former is the second one is inevitable. We haven't talked much about the first one, and I do want to talk about that. But what are the realistic fears we should have around a source of raw intelligence that's pulling from most of, if not all of human information, depending on how these various models are training? What are the legitimate concerns from your perspective that we need to deal with immediately? And what does that have to do with stories?
That's a lot of questions in one. I love it. I'll try to track through, and then you'll correct me if I've missed anything. So the first thing is, are LLMs, or let's just actually broaden it out to, is artificial intelligence in whatever model form it comes in, is that going to take all of our jobs? And humans are really resilient. We're very resilient to technology change, and we're really good at layering on new tasks, new jobs, if you will, new sources of income, et cetera, on top of what used to be done that's been automated. We layer stuff on top to do next, right? To make other things better. So if you think about things as simple as, like, a manufacturing facility, Henry Ford brings in a better way to produce a vehicle, the assembly line. But that didn't get rid of all jobs around vehicles, right? I mean, we have a very rich and healthy vehicle sector at this point, right? And manufacturing sector. So I don't think we're at risk of all jobs going away. I do think, and I was talking with someone the other day who is going to school, they're a college student, and they're studying accounting. And they're like, well, should I be worried? I was like, okay, well, let's think about what you're learning in accounting. How much of that is rule-based? They're like, well, actually, a fair amount of it. Like, great. You can assume that anything that is rule-based is going to be automated, period. How much of that requires subjective perspectives, subjective kind of risk analysis, all that sort, someone making a decision that might not be rule-based? Well, I mean, there's a lot of policy things that are out there that are, you can go either way, right? Like, you can interpret it in a bunch of different ways. Those sorts of things are a lot harder to automate. And so understanding the rule-based work, like, you have to understand that to be able to make the other decisions. But that will just kind of reduce the drudgery that you have to take care of by having those rule-based things automated. But it doesn't get rid of that second piece, right? And I'm not sure right now how many accounting firms want to hand over all of their risk decisions to a machine, right? Because there's a huge amount of damage that could be done to their accounting firm if something was done improperly in the programming, if something wasn't taken into account, basically if you've taken the human out of the loop. So just as an example of, like, it's very nuanced whether machines are going to come and take our jobs. And from an LLM standpoint, my favorite thing is, I have a daughter in college and a son who's about to go to college. And at the beginning of this LLM space, about 2 years ago, people were like, oh my gosh, every term paper ever is now going to be written by LLMs. And it was like, oh, people are going to be cheating all over the place and professors aren't going to know. Well, it turns out professors are pretty darn smart. And so they've created their own models that can detect when something is, has been created by an artificial agent. So, like, it just takes a minute for that kind of back and forth to happen. And I think that showing that evolution, showing that there's kind of it will reach an equilibrium, it's just an important kind of data point to look at. So that's the first thing. That's the jobs thing. before I move on, I'm going to talk about what I wish people knew. Do you have anything on that?
No, I mean that makes sense. I'll come back to it, I think,
Okay.
but let's
Okay.
continue.
So, what I wish people knew, I really, really, really think, and I spoke about this in Manhattan Beach I was invited to a TEDx event there, and I spoke about this. I really wish that our elected officials were held to task a bit more about understanding what is happening in the tech space and really being at least conversant. They don't need to be expert, but conversant. And being conversant 6 months ago actually right now makes you're out of it, right? Like you have to stay up to date. The number of things that are changing on a weekly basis is actually quite astonishing. And so they need to really be taken to task to stay conversant and up to date. And one of the best ways to do that is to help society, to help their constituents to stay on top of things. And if we want to look at a nice analogy, like how do we stay on top of what is in our food? We label it, right? We label, hey, this is where it came from. Here's what's in it. Here's a percentage of your daily value. Blah 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 blah. We should be doing the same thing with our artificial agent systems. We should know when artificial agents are involved with something. If I'm going to jump on a phone call with a help center and I'm dealing with an artificial agent, it should be like, hey, you're about to speak with an artificial agent. That's not a bad thing. Like, okay, great. Now I know what I'm doing. Now I know what I'm dealing with, right? So it's kind of getting that labeling out there. It's getting the understanding out there. But to create policies like that, these elected officials across the board, and this is an apolitical statement, across the board, they need to be conversant. They need to be knowledgeable about what's possible, what the risks are, and how to communicate those things to their constituencies.
Mm-mm.
So that's that piece. I think your last piece was, where does story have to play into this? And it really goes back to what is going to resonate most with me. We have democratized, we've watched democratization movements for the past almost 2 decades of like, I resin printed this piece of technology this is actually a pretty awesome piece of technology that my company makes. The boards and whatnot inside, we had to send away to fabricate, but like I resin printed all of a bunch of the pieces that are non silicon. And that's, democratization of manufacturing. There's been, I worked on space stuff for a while, like outer space stuff. There's democratization of space, right? Like I helped a high school in Southern California launch a satellite, a CubeSat that they could operate, from their science classroom. Like that's wild. But as we look at the democratization of self, how do we hyper personalize those things around us for our purposes, not for the purposes of selling me something new, but for the purpose of making my life better objectively for me? The only way to do that is to understand my story. And the only way for me to communicate my story to other people is for me to understand it first. Right? It's for me to be able to pull it all together and to say, hey, these are my values. These are the things that are important to me, not just because I'm told that I should say those things are important to me, but because in looking at myself, I've been able to draw those things out. And it turns out like I actually really do value autonomy as it relates to my choice of, choosing schools for my kids or whatever it might be, right? Like whatever it is, like I actually do value that. And maybe I don't value so much the idea of, giving people unlimited gun rights. Like it sounds good, but like, maybe I actually would kind of don't dig that, right? And so like there are things that I can challenge myself on where I get chirping of the world telling me one way to think, but actually internally, when I start expressing myself and sharing my story, you can start digging out these roots of, well, actually, the way you're talking, the way you speak, you actually don't value it that way. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I was actually thinking about an anecdote you gave in one of your TED Talks where you talked about some things about yourself that when you did your narrative that you missed.
Yeah.
And I've thought about this with myself. Like I consider myself a fairly self-aware person, but there are definitely things that 4 or 5 years later, I'm like, oh, I thought I valued X, but my actions don't actually indicate that I value X the way that I thought I did.
Yeah.
Um, and I was thinking about AI and LLMs and what we can and cannot use this for. I'm a teacher, but I'm kind of a unique teacher in that I work for a public school, but mostly in a digital space.
Mm-hmm.
And we were initially afraid that AI was going to overcome and destroy us. And the opposite has kind of been true. We like every cycle we have a ton of LLM based cheating. um we read through that very quickly. The kids realize we'll catch them. We do have software that help us, but honestly we don't check the software on every piece of writing. We check it when the writing reads like it's an AI.
Right.
And at first I thought I wouldn't be able to detect it. Within the first like month I was like, oh, I can't, once they get smart enough to take out the this is an AI, but
Right.
that I couldn't detect it because it did read like a generic high school student. But actually over a year I was like, no, I can tell the patterns of the thinking myself. Not I don't even need I need software to prove it for legal reasons.
Mm-hmm.
um and what we started to do, instead of just taking a punitive task to this, I started asking the students, okay, you guys say AI is like a calculator for writing. I'm going to take your word on that for a change. Show me each step. Show me your work just like your math teacher makes you show me. Like, show me your draft. Show me what's part of this is coming from you. Because what I realized is the students have a misguided idea that if you plug something in, the AI is going to plug something back out the way they think Google works in an ideal case
Mm-hmm.
usage, which Google doesn't work that way either, but like that's what they think. And they definitely think that with LLMs. And I was like, well, actually, you can use it, but you actually have to engage with it in such a way that you're going to know the topic by the end of the session if you do it well. And it's going to have a lot of your own personality, and it's not going to be exactly the same kind of work as writing, but it is work. Or we can enter a world where AI chatbots grade your AI generated paper and none of us learn anything and society falls apart. And when when the AI start breaking, you have no idea how to fix them. So, what do you want to do here? And I've gotten a lot of interesting pushback from educators. There's people who are defeatist, who basically think we are going to enter this world of AIs, grading AIs, and that's our only option. And I'm like, well, I'm already proving that that's not the case.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also people who are, we must battle the technology tooth and nail. And, if we have to go back to writing things on paper or even in chisel rock, that's what we're going to do. And I also find that ludicrous. And then there's been a third case scenario where, and I'm serious, some digital programs have removed all writing from their curriculum in an English class, which is absurd. Um, uh, and I was thinking about your stuff about stories because I'm like, the story I'm telling myself about the use cases of this LLM is going to change my attitude
Mm-hmm.
towards the LLM, and it's going to change what I think we can do with it. And I want to talk about labeling for a second. One thing I would love to know, I don't know how we'd know this, but like, is a task an energy cost actually more efficient when I'm doing it for AI or when I'm doing it with a human? And where is that cost and power coming from? Is it coming from the user? Is it coming from investors? Is it coming from the back end? And right now, I don't know that. When I look at like AI based power usage, for example, I actually find wildly different projections and stats. And so, from that narrative standpoint that you're saying, I can't construct a narrative about whether or not I'm being efficient, and that actually does matter to me. I would prefer not to burn down a rainforest to make Studio Ghibli memes, but if this actually enables me to work more efficiently, and save power, even if it has a higher power cost on one end, it might have a lower on another. If I had appropriate labeling, maybe I could do something with that, or maybe we could start figuring out ways to diffuse the power model in a different way instead of just pumping power into it. There are other engineering options that we could have with this technology, but it requires transparency, and unfortunately that seems to be the thing we don't have with these models. I know that you've advocated, explicitly about a lot of transparency issues here, but how should we create a better narrative, a better story about our relationship to AI that enables it to use it responsibly, both as individuals and socially? And what do we need for that narrative to be more viable? Because there's stuff we don't know, just like there's stuff we don't know about ourselves.
Right. Wow, there's there are so many things in there that I want to respond to. The first one is I love the idea of show your work. I think that is I had not heard that previously. I think that is one of the smartest things I've heard, because one of the things, again, I have 3 children and we've talked a lot about, emergence of these tools and whatnot. And one of my kids was writing some end of year essays and really struggling with how to communicate their thoughts. I was like, okay, well, let's do this. Let's just stream of consciousness, write it down of what you're trying to communicate and put it in a paragraph if you need to, but like, don't worry about punctuation. Don't worry about, bullet point the things that you need to, whatever. And then we went in and I think we used Gemini, because he was in Google Docs, used Gemini and was like, hey, summarize this for me. Right. And just that step, he didn't use that summary because that wasn't the task. That wasn't the assignment. But he was able to then take that and make sense of what was here and really use it as a tool to better communicate what he was trying to get across in his essay. And that sprung him through what was really a roadblock. Right. And so I love your idea of like show work, because that would be a place where he's like, hey, I couldn't get past this. I needed something. I did this. And I would guess as a teacher, I might reward that, right? Like that's a really innovative way of using a tool, right? So I love that. I'm going to share that if I can as an example, because I think it's a really strong one. So well done on your part. That's fantastic. On the transparency piece, you brought up the energy cost, and there are people that will joke about like, oh, I just did a search on ChatGPT and that cost a bottle of water, right? And they're like, ha ha ha. And it's like, well, I mean, do we really want to laugh about that? Is that really silly? Is that really funny? Is it really true? Like, I'm not sure, right? And we talk about this with cryptocurrencies as well. Like, people talk about with the continued proliferation of value with Bitcoin, will at some point in time all the energy on the planet be going toward Bitcoin? And it's like, well, I don't. Okay, like I can draw like really, really interesting plots too, and like extrapolate them into the future and show something interesting, but that's not necessarily going to make it a reality. But what you're raising is something that's very important, which is that information of what's happening today exists. We know the cost. We know the burden. We know the value of these things, right? And you really only need a few different data points. You need to know the burden on the environment. You need to know the cost to the system. You need to know the value to the system. And you can, those are on different time scales and whatnot, but like finance is pretty easy. Like calculus is pretty easy. And so you can figure all that out. The problem is none of that is transparent, right? And so again, who's going to help make that transparent? Well, it surely isn't going to be elected officials who are non-conversant in how things work, right? And again, this is an apolitical statement. Like I have people, I'm a nerd. I'll watch C-SPAN. I'll listen to some of these just generic hearings, and I'm like, what are they even talking? Like they're like trying to show that they know something about some like random arbitrary thing. They're not talking about the real issues. The real issues are like what information isn't being shared that would get us to a better answer around who wins. And maybe how is it that we can make a lot of people win at once, right? Because it isn't that if you, and I think there's a fear in the technology space, and I'm sure that, at some point someone has said this to, and I'll just leave names out, but choose your technology leader. That like, if this information gets out, like all of a sudden our profit margins will go down or whatever, right? I don't actually believe that's true. I actually believe if I knew what Gmail, like the value of Gmail to Google, of me using Gmail, if I knew what that was, I might be actually willing to pay them to use it instead of them like sourcing my data off and selling it off. And maybe I'd pay them more just because I want that privacy. Right? But we don't even know, right? If they make $100 off of me, would I be willing to pay 150? Maybe. But like, since we don't know, since there's no transparency, we have no way to make that trade-off. So that the transparency piece is so huge. And unfortunately, a lot of society walks around thinking like these things are unknowable. And it's just because they're big and they're hard. Right. And so it's a lot easier to be like, I don't know, like that's who knows, right? And to jump onto like, some sort of bandwagon where it's like, well, they say this about water, but there's more than enough water in the oceans, or whatever it might be, right? And for me, it's just like, hey, let's like get the information out there, because humans are really stinking smart, and we'll come up with a solution that will bring us to an equilibrium. So that's what I would say about that transparency piece. The other piece that I would want to share, and I'm sorry if you can hear my dog barking in the background. But the other piece that I would like to share is that we really, I wish that we all would look at technology as a tool instead of as a solve all, right? So like, what is the first tool that a human had? The first tool a human had, I would argue, was a rock. Why? Because it really hurt to knock out some sort of game with my fist, right? So if I used a rock, great. Or if it was really hard to break another rock with my fist, so I used another rock to do it, right? Technology, it is just tools. They don't solve everything. It's not meant to solve everything. It's not meant to make everything convenient. It's meant to reduce just enough friction that you can do more, do something better, whatever it might be. And unfortunately, I think we have this mindset right now that is somewhat dangerous, where it's like, if I can reduce all the friction in my life using this technology thing, then my life is going to be better. But we see that people who throw everything in their lives toward technology and like get these conveniences, they fall into depression, they fall into getting stuck, they fall into because people actually need some friction in their life. It's what makes us grow. It's what makes us thrive. And so this idea of technology as a tool is something that I wish people would really embrace and think back to, okay, it's a tool, so it does X, Y, and Z, but I'm still responsible for doing these other things. Does that make sense?
Makes perfect sense. I mean, it's an interesting, you were talking about technology and democratization of things, but I think this is a flip side of that democratization, which is the algorithmization of things. So, for example, what I do, I'm a teacher by day. My second, job is this educational podcast, and on one hand, I was trained in traditional media in the late 90s before I decided to be a teacher. I know what it used to take to do any video. I know what it used to take. I mean, I've even seen the bad old days before the mid 1990s where we had to like hand cut and paste things onto a mat to figure out what went on in the newspaper. Now, they weren't doing that by the time I had access to it. I'm not that old, but I've seen it.
Right.
And it really wasn't that long ago. I mean, it's only a generation ago, or 2 generations ago, effectively, but that was the only way to do these things. That's been rapidly democratized.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I've seen things like social media, which actually began fairly democratically, and like the algorithms were your friend, peers, et cetera, be increasingly algorithmatized in ways that are non-transparent. Like, I don't know what the Google algorithm is prioritizing from week to week. I don't know what Facebook is doing other than probably trying to get me to pissed off. So because if I'm pissed off, I'll stay on the platform more. I'm going to argue with people. Our X or whatever. I mean, we do know those things are happening, but we don't even know like when they're doing that, when they're not. And that's anti-democratic. And I find this contradictory nature of the current technology sphere really having people do 2 contradictory things. One is the thing you describe, which is they increasingly see the tool as a way to remove all friction from their life. And the other thing is when that doesn't work, or when they don't understand it, or when there's these other like these democratic things that also have these hidden anti-democratic things in them and stuff, they write off the whole thing and basically think we can't do anything with this under any case scenario and under any use case. And I see that a lot, particularly with AI, where people are either like, it's going to solve every single problem we ever have and also maybe make us irrelevant, or it's useless, it's just a scam, and it can't really do anything. And I have found that, I have fluctuated at times between both extremes. I want to be clear on that. I'm not removed from this, like false binary here. But I have found that, because I have to work within an education, actually, that I started being like, okay, how do we deal with this without just going, we're just going to let it run rampant and do whatever it's going to do because we can do nothing about it ever. Or we are going to, like, we just have to fight it tooth and nail. And this does seem to me to be a narrative problem. Like, to bring it back to the thing that we're focusing on, stories and stories as currency, this does seem to be a narrative problem about the way we're conceiving of this in ways that limits us. How would you deal with that? It seems to be something you think about a lot.
I do think about it a lot. The social media thing, I think it's worth, and I'd love to run this by you because it's possible you've thought about the following. So in and around the beginning of cable news, all of a sudden I've got to fill 24 hours of news. I've got to fill a 24-hour set of segments. And there just isn't that much news at that time. Because we don't have all the outlets collecting things. We don't have people like capturing things with smartphones that they can share. And, we don't have all the sources of information that we do today. And so it's like, okay, how many different ways can I tell this story? How many different perspectives can I tell the story from? How many times can I repeat that and have people continue to show up? Okay, well, it turns out that they turn off after the first 2 times they hear it. So now let me make it a little bit more fantastical so they continue to listen, like kind of bring them in and hook them in, right? And from there, we have, okay, well, now we've got smartphones. Everybody's got a supercomputer in their pocket, and people want to connect with one another. And whereas we had message boards before, now we've got things like Facebook where you can reach across the world and find these small groups of people who kind of think a lot alike. And yet now I can still connect with them 24 hours a day. I still have that kind of cycle of constant interaction and constant connection. And then it's like, oh, well, wouldn't it be great if we could share photos? Right. I mean, that's how Instagram started, right? Let's share some photos that we can put some really cool filters on. And then it was like, oh, well, wait, but if I do that, I can share a story about the photo. And now I can show somebody how my life is really great. So they feel, really awesome about it and they want to follow me. And how do I again, up the ante to get people to continue to watch me, right? To continue, I've got to do more.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that this kind of state that we find ourselves in right now from a story standpoint, this performative nature, and it is performative across the board. It is, I very much get internally annoyed when people are like, oh, social media is, it's so performative. And if we could just get rid of social media. And I'm like, yo, I have an idea. Get rid of cable news. Get rid of these other things that are absolutely performative in nature because they have to be.
Mm-hmm.
And that it's run to this space where stories are no longer who we are. The stories have become who we want others to see us as, so that they keep watching. And that is something that I really, really struggle with because, we started this conversation by me saying the richest set of data about an individual is their spoken word story.
Mm-hmm.
But it is not the performative one. It is the intentional one, the one that is vulnerable, the one that is, talking about the messiness of self, the one that is talking about, the craziness of relationships and just the things that I struggle with and the things that make me sad and the things that bring me joy, all of that. That's where the value sits in story. That's what's actually going to help me find the right product that's going to help me out or help me get to the right doctor or help me make the right decision as it relates to some aspect of my life. Yet we're surrounded by all these examples of performative stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it isn't just social media, it is basically all media.
Yeah.
And so I'm not against all media. I want to be really clear about that. And I want to be really clear that I think news is very important. I think it's very, very important. But I do think it's interesting to look back, how did we get to where we are today? And it is not AI's fault.
Absolutely.
Right. And the algorithms are just because I've got to fill my equivalent of a news cycle. Right. I have to keep your eyeballs on here because if I don't, I will wither and die.
Mm.
And if we think that there aren't algorithms running for MSNBC, Fox News, all these different things that I use those two because they tend to be accused of, being at war with one another, right? They have algorithms running about how they should pitch things, but they should share, what they shouldn't share, all that sort of stuff, and what words they should use, without a doubt. So AI is just a tool, right? And it's not to blame. What's to blame is the fact that we have gotten ourselves into this, always available, always on, must have something to consume.
Mm.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I didn't mean to
No.
soapbox you there, but AI gets blamed for a lot of stuff when it's just not its fault.
Oh yeah, our social media. I was thinking about all these things I hear about. The most recent thing is anti-intellectualism, but I think about about half a decade to a decade ago as fake news and conspiracy theories. And I just remember going up to people and I grew up in the 80s and 90s, right? Very analog world of my childhood. However, did people not see Unsolved Mysteries
Right.
or I don't know, most of cable news programming? Are, you know, even things that started with very clear educational mandates, like let's say the Discovery Channel. By the late 90s, they were full of all kinds of gunk.
Yep.
And there's no algorithm driving that other than the Nielsen ratings, and there's no, like, you know, there's no Bain Capital or, you know, whatever consortium doing that. There's other things doing that, but my point is, it isn't new. The acceleration and the scale is different, I will
Yep.
admit that. But it's really not new. I weirdly, I was watching Slacker about Austin, and I was thinking about conspiracy culture because it comes up in that movie all the time.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you've seen it, the Linklater movie from 1990.
Yes.
But I was thinking, like, what people think is somehow unique to an X feed or a Facebook feed or a TikTok algorithm, we're just watching people do, whether semi-employed in their apartment in a movie, making fun of these people doing exactly that in a time period where the performativity is just your local community. It's not even
Yep.
you know, the entirety of the planet, of possibly. And while there are some things that you don't have online, like there are social connections and stuff that I think are really important that you don't have online that's expressed in that movie, a lot of things that we're blaming on social media, you can just see expressed in a completely analog way in a completely analog world.
Yep.
And I do think we have to deal with that because the technology is reflecting us back at ourselves, and I think we don't like what we see, and it's easy to blame the technology. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, it really is. I wrote a piece when I was at Rand with this brilliant colleague of mine. His name is Ashande Ashoba, and Ashande and I wrote this piece, and we it was about AI and the risks of AI and the potential for AI, and we called it an intelligence in our own image. And that really is what it is. Right. And so when we look at it and we say, hey, oh my gosh, AI is it's gonna, kill half the planet. Like it's gonna, eliminate this, that, and the other. It's like only because we let it, only because we set the constraints to give it that runway. Because we can easily decide today to constrain the living daylights out of it. And like really stop it in its tracks. So why aren't we? Well, we aren't for we could spend the next 10 hours talking about the reasons that we aren't. But it is important to remember that we could. We have the ability to do so. It is not out of our hands.
one thing I really liked about your work that I saw in doing research on you is this right here, because I so much hear a narrative that it's Tina, but for the technological apocalypse. There is no other way. We have to accept that our robot overlords are coming and they're going to destroy us. And I've one thought, like, what do you think about human beings that you think that's the only thing we could possibly do, because it is just aggregating us back at ourselves? Yeah, and like I like this distinction that you've made, that AI doesn't think like a human, but it does reflect humans. Like it is doing what we told it to do. And if we are deeply uncomfortable with that, it's because we're deeply uncomfortable with ourselves. We assume that, like, of course we'd kill everybody if we had the chance. And I'm like, I don't actually think people would do that. But I don't know what it is about you that you think that, but it does. I do like this intervention with this idea that, like, this only has two outcomes. It's either going to be the enshittification of everything, or it's going to be some utopia, and we have no control over that. And that is the way it is often presented in the media. It is the story that you hear technologists tell. I also won't name names, but I think people know who I'm talking about. And I'm just going like, this thing still does pretty much what we tell it to. I mean, there are some signs that it might get a little antsy these days, and but why aren't you telling it to do better things? I mean, even in terms of like efficiency, I've always thought like, well, why don't we program in more efficiency things into this programming? Like we could, we're not. Like, so
yeah, it's it goes back to what are you trying to do, right? If you are trying to only make more money for a company based on the number of views that you get or clicks that you get or this, that, or the other, you will optimize around that. There will be no multivariate optimization. So you're not optimizing around a bunch of other things. You're just optimizing around that, and you will design around that. And the constraints that you put on the system will be there. And so one of my favorite examples of not setting the right constraint, and this is, I think 2017, 2016, somebody can look this up and tell me I'm wrong, but like there's some professors working in the cryptographic space, and they're like, we're going to see how artificial intelligence can make better cryptography. And so they set the conditions and said, basically make an impenetrable system. And the AI did that and locked them out. And they were like, wait a minute, what? Like the AI locked us out of our own system. Well, they didn't put a constraint in there that said, and make sure we can get in. They said, make it impenetrable, right? Make sure that it is, using all the best techniques that cannot be broken, that cannot be hacked. And it locked them out. And so it is very interesting when we think about how do you correctly set the constraints? How do you correctly think about scoping what you're trying to optimize around, or what you're trying to really what your objective function is for building out a system. And the scary part to me is not the AI, it's the people who are setting those conditions.
Mm-hmm.
And it is, we have, and we talk about this in my company a lot because we're talking about story and we're talking about people's well-being. And one of the things that has come up a lot as we've thought about the longevity space and how people live longer, healthier. I don't mean live longer, period, but just live a healthier life for longer. And one of the areas that's like, underrepresented, that's not a very good way of saying it, but it's like just drastically underrepresented, is women's health.
Mm-hmm.
And you start looking at like, well, why is women's health drastically underrepresented? And it's because, is it because that the constraints of some of these systems are being set by non-women, right? People who don't understand the details of what it is to be a woman? And the answer is yes, right? And it's a really simple example of like, if you do not understand the fullness of the situation, if you do not understand how to set the constraints, you can find yourself in a situation having created something that is beautiful toward the objective function that you set, but is just terrible for 50% of the population because you just didn't know any better. Mm-hmm. And this is where I think we run into problems with AI, is again, the mischaracterization of the bounds, the mischaracterization of the objective functions of what we're trying to achieve. When I say objective function, it's what we're trying to achieve with it. What is the goal? What are we asking the system to do? And then who is programming it? Who is asking it to do that? And that's where, again, I don't know how to do that other than policy. I don't know how to get on top of that other than policy. And unless those policymakers are conversant, we're in the situation we're in today.
mean, my mind's on fire about this, and I think about a couple of different things, but I'm moving away from AI. We'll come back to that in a second. I think about other ways in which we've not stayed up. I am obsessed with manufacturing. That's one of the few jobs I haven't had, and also I work a lot with unions, so I, have this grand narrative history. But I can tell you, both the unions and the anti-union people often have basically a 1930s to 1950s, let's say an interwar and post-war imaginary about what that looks like, what manufacturing looks like. And there's a lot of talk today about bringing it back that is either willfully misleading or actively ignorant. And I'll go back to an example you brought up. You talked about the resin printing thing that you can do, build the casing.
Yep.
All here, resin print, relatively simple. Probably 2 people are involved in that process. If we look at you're right, it is democratized because you need a lot less capital to do it. When you think about that process in the 1950s to build something like that, you probably needed 100 people in various positions to do something equivalent. And that's barring the fact that you probably wouldn't even have conceived of something like that in 1950. But let's just imagine that for a second. So when people talk about turning like the United States into a production powerhouse, one, I know this is going to baffle people because of our trade deficit or whatever. We already are. We're either the second or third, depending on in the last 20 years, every year, industrial producer in the world. It just only employs 10 to 15% of the population now, as opposed to like 30% at its high point. And when people imagine this, they're thinking that we're going to get 1950 style hard hat jobs back. And I'm like, no, you're not. Like, and honestly, why do you really want it? Like, we're complaining about like printed houses that have like 4 contractors that go in and print the concrete. And I'm like, okay, I mean, that's bad if you have a very narrow labor perspective. But from the standpoint of humanity, that's actually great.
Yeah.
Like we can print a house with relatively low resources. It's relatively reliable with concrete with only like 5 people having to oversee it. Both capitalist and socialist societies in the middle of the 20th century would have killed to be able to do that.
Yep.
And we see it as a threat, but we see it as a threat because we have a very outmoded viewpoint of what production would look like now. And we aren't having people put in limits to how we do this because, like, with good policy, this could be a decent thing. If more people were control, if the policy into this was more truly democratized, we could make this great for a great majority of people, not just the rich. But we're not doing that. We're just not. But also the people who are responding to that also have a misguided narrative who thinks like, well, this is only gonna be bad. We basically should be the false characterization of Luddites where we just go smash your machines and try to stay in like a mid 20th century economy that was very bad for the environment, very labor intensive, very resource intensive. And while it did provide like a historical and normal amount of middle class growth, that was not just because of the technology or people up in hard hats. That was because a series of decisions made in the post-war period in a global context, some of which doesn't exist anymore, like these instances of the Soviet Union, but that we don't have. Yep. And so I think when you think about it the way you're telling, you're encouraging us to think about it, we can start thinking about not about whether or not printing houses is good or bad inherently, but what the context for this technology is, and quit trying to fool ourselves that this looks like the way it did 100 or 120 or 200 years ago. Or, even, I mean, we talk about computer technology even 2 years ago. I mean, like, so how would you encourage us to change our mindset so we can better deal with things like that? Because when we talk about AI, you can just get stuck on the AI. I want people to think about like manufacturing and just like, because some like automation's been a thing in manufacturing since Henry Ford. I mean, actually, since before then, we've always tried to automate things.
Yep.
But people were predicting the end of the worker in the 70s before computers were really even advanced. So again, it's not a new problem; it's an accelerating one. But it's also one that I don't think has to be bad. I don't think there's an inherent reason why this has to be bad. But we're not. When we have a very binary or false narrative about this, I think it's going to be bad.
Yeah, so there's a few things. I want to start by, we should be embarrassed as a society for how ill-informed we are about things like the production capacity of the United States today. Right? Like there are so many statistics like that, like the one you referenced, where you walk down the street of any town, city, whatever in this country, and you ask, and people would give you the wrong answer because the right answer is never shared. Right. One of my other favorite ones is that, China owns a majority of our debt. And it's like, no, actually, we own a majority of our debt, it turns
Right.
out. But let's just, we'll set that aside for a minute. So I think that what you raise there is really important. First, we kind of need the basis of understanding from an information standpoint to just get us all on the same page. What's happened while you just kind of laid out a timeline, as we've made progress, as things have changed over time, there's also been this other set of changes that have happened. And this is part of, the global story, the global narrative of, let's just think about it, the United States, which is, there's more expectation for safety in the workforce. There's more expectation for benefits for the workforce. There's more expectation for flexibility with families. There's more expectation for, like, you can't bring back what was 50 years ago or 70 years ago or even 20 years ago without rolling back all of those expectations, without rolling back what the federal minimum wage is, without rolling back all these other things that have been put in place policy-wise for very good reasons. You can't recreate the past without fully recreating the past. And I think that's something else that is like, it's, if you think about it from a story standpoint, it's like you can't tell the story of Star Wars, right? If all you do is eliminate, Luke Skywalker and, then just try to tell the story end to end, and there is no conflict, there is no son, there is no this, there is no that. Like, it's like kind of like the story's broken, right? You have to roll back all of it. And so it's a terrible analogy, but you understand my point.
Yeah, I do.
And so for me, it is, if we look at the manufacturing piece, and people will say like, well, Americans don't want those jobs. They don't want those sorts of, risks in the workplace. But it's more than that. It's more than that. We are used to a level of convenience in the workforce that those jobs would not afford us. They would not provide to us. So like, it's dead on arrival. And this is one of the reasons why when we hear, a political drumbeat, and again, this is an apolitical statement, a political drumbeat about something that's supposed to happen within the corporate world, and you see corporations being like, what? Like, we're not going back that direction. Are you kidding me? Like, we actually kind of like this. I'll use an example of today. Like, this green energy thing actually kind of works for us. Like, we're going to kind of stick with it. Like, we dig it. And so it's, so much of it is, you can't change just one piece of the story and expect it to go back the way it was. You can't adjust just one thing. You also can't just create a new partial narrative that isn't based in fact and expect that to carry the day. And I'll go back to this idea of stories being the most important, valuable source of data. It starts at the individual level that we tell our story, that we understand ourselves, et cetera, and that aggregates upward. For a long time, we've thought about it as disseminating downward. But we have all the tools right now, all the technology right now, if we want to think about it that way, for it to has to aggregate upward. And so we right here at the base are already rejecting a lot of the things that are being said up here, where the stories must aggregate up to this kind of like said reality, or what should be a reality, what hopes to be a reality, or what the policy says that they hope to get to. But the underpinning doesn't work. It's not there. And there's no longer this dissemination from above where, oh, well, I've kind of got to accept what's coming down from the top, because that's where I get all my information, or that's where I get all my services, or that's where I get all my whatever it might be. Well, no, I have so much down here right now. And so we also have to think about it. And this is one of the things about my company. We call ourselves the anti-tech technology firm. And my kids make fun of this because they're like, you're the anti-tech firm. But I'm like, it's not that we're not using technology. It's the fact that we've thought about it the other way around.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We've thought about it with, instead of the technology company driving the big ferry down the river that has everybody as passengers, no, we're going to go ahead and we're going to issue you all kayaks. And you have the ability, you could tie your kayaks together if you want, but like really, we kind of, at this point in time, you kind of need to navigate on your own. And so for me, that's to get to your manufacturing piece, all these other things have to happen. We can't go back in time without changing all this other stuff. So I'm going to just stop there because I'm rambling, but it's really, it's bothersome to me that people think we can. Like it's just bothersome to me that people think we can.
To me, it belies a fundamental failure, not just in education, although there's plenty of that. I work in education, and I wish I could say that we are doing a good job. Individual teachers are trying very hard. I don't want people to think I'm actually coming down on the teachers or even a lot of the administrators. It is systemically lost its purpose. It has too many narratives, and it's not really optimized for any of them. And I say narratives on purpose because what I ask people what they think school is for, and the answers I get are wild. For everything from you're there to babysit us, which in some ways is actually true, to you're there to unlock creative citizens, or you're there to create a viable workforce, and we're here as a stopgap for the poor. And like I said, all these things are in some vague way true, but we're optimized for none of them.
Mm-hmm.
There's and the public anger is in the wrong place a lot of the time. Like, they're angry with teachers, they're angry with the teachers unions, and I'm like, the teachers unions are remarkably not powerful. I hate, I kind of wish that we were as powerful as you guys think we are. But we aren't. Now, are there some teachers unions that pull some shenanigans, particularly in certain coastal states? Absolutely. But in the main, that particular grouping has some power as a voting block, but that's about it. And their power as a voting block is actually much more limited than people realize.
Yeah.
And I think about this when you talk about a technology company or anything like that. Like, what are we trying to do? How are we optimizing for it? And what could we do for that? And before I became a teacher, I did all kinds of things. I worked in the insurance and financial sector. I was a corrections officer for a very little while. That was one of the worst experiences of my life. But nonetheless, like I've seen all kinds of parts of our society and economy, and I I think about these social functions that don't have anything to do with AI. They don't have anything to do even with manufacturing sometimes. But the problems we're describing and the misidentification of the public um, is super common. And I want to emphasize something that you said. We are not saying that the public's stupid.
Mm-hmm.
We are not saying it's the public's fault for having this misidentification. We are giving them narratives that close them off from understanding larger things. It's like if you tell yourself some performative narrative on a TikTok and all of a sudden you're completely unaware of your own emotions and you're making a wreck of your life. It's like a social form of the same thing.
Yes.
And I've really I've really enjoyed your focus on stories for this because I do think against the technologists. I used to kind of agree with the technologist. Well, I shouldn't say the technologist, the data scientists who were like, oh, the anecdotes are screwing us up. And I'm like, but the anecdotes are the way people not just understand the data, but have any ability to contextualize data at all. We think
Mhm.
narratively, whether you like it or not. And I think we should like it. I think we should just accept that. But then how do we get that rich data? And then how do we contextualize this other data in a rich way? Because so many people, and you know, I do think one side's or one of many sides, I actually don't think there's two sides, is worse than the other. But I think all of American and maybe even Western society has a massive misidentification of problems because they're not really looking at themselves in a vulnerable way because everything's becoming so performative. Like I feel like politics now, like trying to ask someone to keep up with AI is also like, yeah, can you do something other than perform for your donors, please?
Yeah.
Like, it's really important, and yet it's also something that's very hard to get people to do. So, as my final question is, how would you encourage people to think about this in a way that really gets them to take their story seriously, but not just a story that they say to the public and not just a story that they tell themselves to feel good about themselves, but the story that would enable them to see who they actually are, contextualize that, and act on it? How would you encourage people to do that? It's a huge question, I know, but that's why it's the last one.
It's that's a really good question. I want to reiterate something that you said. I do not by any means think that the public is dumb.
Mhm.
I think people are actually very smart. I also, though, believe that if you are fed the same thing over and over again, and you have no choice but to your narrative will shift with it, and I mean, it's just the way humans work. So, but I do think if equipped with the right information, and I mean fact,
Mhm.
that people will they'll interpret it as they will, but it still is would be a lot better off than the huge blind spots we have today. So your question, how can people do this better? Well, I think the first thing, and I think there's a saying that I have, that I use just kind of across the board in my life, and I have for a long time, and so much so that I have it tattooed on my arm, and I'm not like a tattoo guy. And it's the saying is consider that you might be wrong. And I go into every situation to include when I'm doing self-reflection. When I'm running through a scenario in my head and I'm like, okay, how could I have done that better? Or how did that go? Or whatever. I continually consider that I might be wrong. That isn't to say I walk in being like, oh my gosh, you're an idiot. You did this wrong. Like, I can't believe you. But it is like, allow for that sliver to exist, that like if you're wrong, it's okay, right? If you're wrong, you're ready to onboard that new information, to build that into your narrative, to build that into your story, to build that into your context. and to, kind of, if you will, aggregate that along with everything else.
Mm.
And so the first thing is to be honest with ourselves while considering that we may be wrong, and to find a space to be vulnerable in. And I understand in like a society where men have, in some cases, been, uh, you know, have been told to be less masculine. In a society where it's confused, the role of gender is confused sometimes, and I'm not saying for good or for bad. I'm just saying it's confused. The word vulnerable and saying be vulnerable kind of seems really, really scary. But you have to find a space to be vulnerable, whether that's with a spouse or a friend or a sibling, or speaking into an artificial agent. My company, that's what we create. We create artificial agents that you can reflect to, where your information is completely private. It's completely secure at your, with just you. You're the only one who has a key. But it gives you a space to reflect. It gives you a space to be vulnerable. And only then can you best understand who you are, what you value, where you need to go, the next steps that you should take. And it isn't that someone's giving you the recipe to move forward. It's instead the information about you is being presented back to you. And you can make a better decision moving forward from there based on what you've been handed. And so, considering you might be wrong, be vulnerable, and explore the whole space. Explore the totality of yourself as it relates to everything else. Be confident and be happy with who you are, and then also want to be better.
Mhm.
Right. um and I say that because it's so hard to feel confident about who you are if you look at social media for 30 seconds.
Oh yeah.
It's really hard. It's really hard. And so those are the things that I would talk about. I mean, it's it's really easy to say go find a therapist, or go pick up a workbook or what, but it really comes down to one of the most powerful things we can do is speak our story out loud. And whether you're doing that in a closed bedroom in front of a mirror, or you're doing it to a trusted person in your life, or you're doing it, in a journal, you will be able to make better sense of what's going on by just being truthful and vulnerable and forcing yourself to actually take that exercise seriously. And if I had told you this 5 years ago, I would have thought that I was crazy. But for the past 5 years, upon building this company and looking what technology allows for, and seeing how much insight we can get on ourselves, I am such a zealot about this because I've seen it work. I've seen people do this to, just as simple as talking their story out loud, and change their careers, like their relationship with their bosses. I've seen them fix their marriages. I've seen them fix their financial outlook and how they're spending money, and reassess what their values are. It's incredible the power that you have at the individual level if you just do this.
Mm. I think that's powerful. Where can people find your work, Bill?
So there's a few things. So one, I'm actually releasing a book in the fourth quarter of this year called The Story Economy. It is focused on actually how you can create wealth with your story.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a whole nother that's a whole nother story, if you will, but that's a whole nother topic. But it is that our data is so valuable. How can we create wealth with our data, and starting with our story? You can find me online at William Welser the fourth, so IV. And then my company is Lotic.ai. And we are building artificial relational intelligence that helps people have a more interpersonal interaction with artificial intelligence to help them do the things I just described.
All right. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm glad that people. I actually do think what you're talking about is super important and it's useful in a variety of context, and so I hope people really did listen to this one. Um, when you approached me, I was a little skeptical, and then I actually listened to a couple of your TED Talks, and I'm not a TED Talk lover. I'm going to be honest, but you were talking about things that I think about all the time, which is like the way that we train ourselves to tacitly accept or not accept certain things. What kind of material inputs can we do to change that? How do we get past like these false binaries? And I really do think it matters that we do that and start using our stories and our narratives in a way that empowers us to know ourselves better and to know our society better, as opposed to ones that empower people to basically take advantage of us.
Right.
And I think a lot of what you're talking about is crucial first steps to doing that. So I'm going to end on that thought.
I appreciate you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.